It was a Sunday like any other. A crisp autumn breeze whispered through the trees of a quiet suburban neighborhood in California. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the sky as the Whitley family made their way home from church. Landon, a bright-eyed 8-year-old with a mischievous grin, sat in the backseat of the family's old Pontiac Sunfire. His parents, Andy and Julie, were in the front, enjoying the serenity of the drive, their thoughts still lingering on the morning sermon. The road stretched out before them, smooth and familiar, lined with rows of maple trees whose leaves fluttered gently in the wind. Everything about that afternoon felt simple, peaceful, and full of life. But there are moments in life when everything changes in the blink of an eye. It's in those fleeting seconds, those silent pauses, that the world shifts like a breath caught in time. And for the Whitley family, that moment was about to arrive. As they approached a busy intersection, Julie caught the glint of headlights out of the corner of her eye. In a flash, everything went from calm to chaos. "Watch out," Andy yelled, his voice sharp with panic. But the words were swallowed by the screech of tires and the deafening crash that followed. Landon's world exploded into a blur of twisted metal, shattered glass, and confusion. The screeching of the ambulance was the last sound he heard before everything went dark. His small body was thrown violently within the confines of the car, his mind blank with the shock of impact. The ambulance had been racing through the intersection, its sirens cutting through the air as it collided with the family's vehicle. The force of the crash was devastating. Andy, his father, was knocked unconscious, his body mangled beyond recognition. Julie, his mother, was thrown across the seat, her vision blurred as pain overwhelmed her senses. But it was Landon who bore the worst of it. His world went dark. In that darkness, a moment of death awaited him. The second that followed felt like a lifetime. Paramedics rushed the scene, their hands shaking as they searched for signs of life. They found Landon pinned beneath the wreckage, his chest still and silent. They worked tirelessly, performing CPR, but it seemed hopeless. His body lay limp, unresponsive, with no heartbeat to speak of. Twice, his heart stopped. Twice, Landon died on that fateful day. But what came next, what happened after he passed, was a story that would alter the course of his life, and his mother's forever. As Landon's body lay on the verge of death, something extraordinary began to unfold. He was no longer aware of the pain or the chaos surrounding him. Instead, he found himself drifting, floating, through a realm of indescribable peace. It wasn't an empty nothingness, but a place of presence, of calm, where the burdens of the world simply did not exist. For those few moments, time seemed to have no meaning. The pain, the fear, the terror that once gripped him, all melted away into a profound stillness. And as he drifted further into the space, Landon realized something that would change him forever. He was not alone. A light so brilliant, so warm, surrounded him. He felt as though he was walking on streets made of gold, the ground beneath him radiant with a light that did not burn, but soothed. His eyes, wide with wonder, traced the sight of figures moving toward him, figures that seemed both familiar and yet he had never seen before. The angels glowed softly, their presence filled with love that transcended everything Landon had ever known. And then there he was. Landon stood before a figure, tall and radiant, whose very presence filled him with awe. It was Jesus, the one he had heard about in Sunday school, the one whose teachings had shaped his world. But this Jesus was not the distant figure he had imagined. This Jesus stood before him, full of love, full of purpose, and Landon knew in an instant this was no dream. In that moment, the world of the living and the world of the dead blurred into one. Landon saw his father, Andy, standing beside Jesus, smiling with love that transcended all earthly pain. And not just his father. Other faces, unfamiliar to him, yet somehow not strangers, surrounded him. Faces of loved ones who had passed before him, family members he had never met, yet whose presence felt as though they had always been part of his life. It was here, in this profound encounter, that Landon's life would take a turn he could never have imagined. But this was only the beginning of the journey he would return to share. The mission that lay before him was one he could not deny, and the message he was entrusted with would change everything. Landon returned to the world of the living, his body revived and his heart filled with purpose. But before he could understand the full depth of his experience, his mother, Julie, would have to come to terms with a reality that would test her faith in ways she could never have imagined. And the truth Landon brought back? It was just the beginning. If you want to be part of our community and receive a special message in our next video, leave a comment with your name and city, and don't forget to hit the like button. Who knows? Maybe you'll be the next one we mention. Subscribe and join us on this incredible journey of discovery. It was an ordinary Sunday afternoon in the small town of Oakville, nestled in the quiet hills of Northern California. The streets were bathed in the warm glow of the late autumn sun, and the world seemed to move at its usual pace, with families preparing for dinner and children laughing in the parks. For Landon, a young boy full of life and curiosity, this day seemed like no different than any other. He had spent the morning with his parents at church, sitting beside his mother, Julie, and father, Andy, listening to the soft hum of the choir and the preacher's comforting words. It was a routine that grounded him, a small pocket of peace in a world that often felt too big for his 8-year-old shoulders. But little did Landon know, the tranquility of that Sunday would soon be shattered. They were driving home in their trusted old Pontiac, the car humming softly as they navigated through familiar streets. Landon sat in the back seat, his eyes half closed as he stared out the window, lost in thoughts only an 8-year-old could have. The air in the car was warm, the sound of his parents' gentle conversation lulling him into a calm comfort. The world outside seemed to move so slowly, until it didn't. Suddenly, without warning, a blinding flash of metal and sound crashed into their lives. A screeching siren, the blur of an ambulance coming through the intersection, and then the violent collision. The world seemed to explode around him. Landon's body was thrown forward as the car crumpled around him, the windows shattering, the metal folding in on itself. His ears rang with the sound of crushing steel, his heart pounding in his chest as if it might break free. His mother's scream, a sound of raw, primal fear, was the last thing he heard from her. Then darkness. Landon's world faded to black, and in the silence, he felt something else take over. It was as if the pain, the fear, and the confusion all disappeared in an instant, replaced by a sense of floating, a strange, weightless calm. He couldn't remember the crash, not fully. His mind was too foggy, too distant. But he did remember the feeling of being outside of himself, of being pulled away from his broken body, as if he were somehow being taken somewhere else entirely. And then he was gone. When he awoke, it was not to the sound of voices or the smell of the hospital. No, it was to something far more extraordinary. He was no longer in the car, no longer surrounded by the wreckage. He was standing at the edge of a vast, golden landscape, the ground beneath him shimmering with ethereal light. Before him, stretching as far as the eye could see, were golden streets. And in the distance, he saw figures walking toward him, bathed in a warm, heavenly glow. He couldn't understand what was happening at first, but there was a peace here, unlike anything he had ever known. A peace so profound that even the memory of the crash seemed like a distant nightmare. He didn't feel pain. He didn't feel fear. All he felt was love and warmth. In the distance, there was a figure, a man, tall and radiant, walking toward him. As he drew closer, Landon's heart swelled. He knew, without a shadow of a doubt, who this was. It was Jesus. Landon's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded, but there was no fear, just awe, wonder, and a profound sense of knowing that he was standing in the presence of something divine. Jesus smiled at him, a warm, knowing smile. And as Landon gazed into his eyes, he felt a calmness, a peace that filled every corner of his being. There were no words exchanged yet, but the message was clear. It was as if Jesus was telling him that everything was going to be okay, that he had not died by accident. No, this was something far greater than that. It was a moment meant to change his life, to change the lives of others, and to show him the truth. Before Landon could gather his thoughts, he heard another voice calling his name. It was familiar, and when he turned, he saw two people walking toward him, their faces radiant with love. His heart skipped a beat. It was his father, and though Landon hadn't expected to see him here, in this place of heaven, the sight of him brought an overwhelming rush of emotion. There was his dad, standing tall and strong, just as he remembered, His father was smiling at him, as though nothing had changed, as though there had been no accident, no tragedy, just peace. Landon rushed forward, arms outstretched, but then something extraordinary happened. As his father took his hand, Landon looked around and saw other faces, too, people he did not know, but somehow he knew them. They were family, relatives he had never met in his earthly life. There were 2 siblings, babies Landon had never known. And yet, in that moment, they were family. He could feel it. It was in this moment that Landon realized there was more to life than what he had ever imagined. There was a deeper truth, one that stretched beyond the limits of human understanding. This place, this encounter, was just a glimpse of the divine, a glimpse of what lay beyond the veil of death. But before he could comprehend more, he heard another voice. This time, it was a command, a message he would never forget. "Go back," the voice said. It was Jesus' voice, gentle but firm. "You have work to do." And with that, Landon felt himself being pulled away, his body torn between this beautiful realm and the harsh reality of the world he had left behind. The transition was jarring. The peace, the warmth, the light, all of it seemed to fade as he was thrust back into his broken body. And then pain. Pain like nothing he had ever felt before. But more than that, the weight of what he had just experienced, the weight of that divine encounter, would stay with him forever. Landon wasn't sure how long he'd been gone, or how long he'd been lying there, unconscious. But as he opened his eyes, he knew one thing for certain. The life he had known would never be the same again. The world was a blur when Landon finally opened his eyes again. He wasn't sure where he was, but he could tell something had shifted. There was an unfamiliar beeping sound in the background, and the smell of antiseptic was sharp in the air. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, as though it belonged to someone else. His mind was racing, the memories of the bright, golden landscape still vivid in his mind. Where was he? How had he gotten here? The moment he tried to sit up, a wave of dizziness hit him, and he collapsed back against the pillow. His vision swam, and for a moment, he was sure he would pass out again. But then, a soft voice reached his ears. "Landon?" He turned his head slowly, finding his mother sitting by his bedside, her eyes red and swollen, her face pale but relieved. She smiled at him, her hand shaking as she reached out to touch his arm. "You're awake," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank God you're awake." Landon wanted to speak, to tell her everything, but the words wouldn't come. His mouth felt dry, and his throat was tight, as if the very act of speaking would break something inside him. He swallowed, trying to find the right words, but only a weak gasp escaped his lips. His mother, Julie, seemed to understand. She squeezed his hand, tears streaming down her face. "It's okay, sweetie. You've been through a lot. You're safe now. Everything is going to be okay." But Landon wasn't sure about that. In his mind, he was still standing at the edge of that golden landscape, still feeling the warmth of Jesus' presence, still hearing that voice, telling him to go back. Go back. The words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the mission he was now carrying within him. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something extraordinary was unfolding, that his life had just been thrust onto a different path. He had to know more. As the days passed, Landon slowly recovered from the physical injuries of the crash. His body was bruised and battered, but the doctors assured his family that he would be okay. They were surprised by his quick recovery, though none of them knew the true reason behind it. They chalked it up to his youth, his resilience. But Landon knew better, the experience in that other world, where he stood in the presence of Jesus and saw his father, the father he had lost years ago, had left a mark on him. It had ignited a fire within him, a longing to understand, to learn more, and to discover why he had been chosen for this divine encounter. But his family didn't understand. They were relieved that he was alive, that the doctors had done their best to patch him up, but they couldn't see the change in him. To them, Landon was still the same boy, the same son. Yet to Landon, everything had changed one evening, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying the images from that other world in his mind. A thought struck him. He couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something more to his life than what he had been told, more to his existence than what he had known before. He had seen the truth, had touched the divine, and now he had to share it. It wasn't enough to just experience it. He had to do something with it. But how? That night, as the house fell silent and his parents settled into their routine, Landon slipped out of bed. He walked quietly down the hall and into the kitchen, where his mother's Bible lay open on the counter. He had seen it many times before, but he had never been particularly interested in it. To him, it was just a book. But now, in the stillness of the night, the words on the pages seemed to beckon him, as though they were calling out to him. Landon reached for the Bible, his fingers brushing over the worn pages. As he opened it, he immediately found a verse that resonated with him. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future." Jeremiah 29, verse 11. The words seemed to glow in the dim light of the kitchen. Landon couldn't explain it, but in that moment, he knew deep within himself that this was the answer. This was the message. He was meant for something greater. He had been given a glimpse into the divine realm for a reason, and it wasn't just to heal or to return to his old life. No, Landon understood now that he was being called to something bigger, something that would require all of him. But what was that something? Landon spent the rest of the night reading, his heart racing with each verse he uncovered, each passage that seemed to speak directly to him. He felt his connection to the divine growing stronger, and with it, his sense of purpose. He couldn't explain why, but he knew he had been chosen. In the days that followed, Landon started noticing things that he hadn't before. He would pass by a stranger and feel a sudden, overwhelming urge to pray for them. Or he would see a family member struggling with a decision and feel compelled to offer guidance, though the words came to him almost miraculously. But it wasn't just about helping others. There was something else, something more profound, that began to stir in his soul. Landon realized that the calling he felt was not just about guiding others, but about guiding himself. He had been chosen to be a vessel of truth, to bring the light of the divine into the world. And that meant following the path of faith, even when it was difficult. As the days turned into weeks, Landon found himself increasingly drawn to his spiritual journey. There was a fire burning inside of him, one that he could not ignore. And the more he embraced it, the clearer the path ahead became. The vision he had seen, the calling he felt, it was all coming together. But he also knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, doubts, and fears along the way. But Landon was determined. He had seen a glimpse of something far greater than this world, and he couldn't turn back now. Landon's life had been turned upside down. What once seemed like an ordinary existence was now overshadowed by something far greater, something he could no longer ignore. The more he delved into Bible, the more he felt a divine fire burning within him. It was as though the words were speaking directly to his soul, guiding him towards something unimaginable. Yet, there was still so much uncertainty. He had heard the voice calling him back, the voice of Jesus that told him there was a purpose for him, that his life would never be the same. But what was he supposed to do with this newfound knowledge? What was his mission? Landon spent days reflecting on this, the weight of the uncertainty hanging heavy on his heart. He couldn't ignore the pull he felt to reach others, to help them see what he had experienced. But how? How could he, a young man with no special qualifications or understanding, carry such a message? One night, as he knelt beside his bed, praying with everything inside him, a sense of peace washed over him. The questions that had haunted him for days slowly began to fade, replaced by a calm certainty. Landon knew that this mission was not just about grand gestures or making sweeping changes. It was about the little things, the moments when he reached out to those around him, when he shared his story with just one person, when he showed kindness and love to those who needed it most. Landon's mission wasn't about preaching to large crowds. It was about showing people that there was more to life than what they saw in the material world. It was about showing them the peace, the love, and the purpose that he had found in his own journey. He began with his family, sharing with them his newfound faith, the things he had seen, and the divine presence he had felt. They were skeptical at first, of course, but there was a change in Landon, a peace in his eyes, a depth in his voice that couldn't be ignored. As the days passed, Landon found that his mission was unfolding in unexpected ways. It wasn't about grand speeches or dramatic moments. It was about the small, everyday acts of love and faith. He began to listen more, to reach out to those who were struggling, offering his words and prayers. He didn't need to have all the answers. In fact, he didn't have any answers at all. He simply needed to share his story, to be the vessel through which others could experience the light he had encountered. One day, while walking through a local park, Landon came across a woman sitting alone on a bench. Her face was etched with sadness, and her eyes were distant, lost in thought. Landon hesitated for a moment, but then the urge to speak to her washed over him. He walked over slowly, unsure what to say, but somehow knowing that he had to say something. "Excuse me," he said softly, his voice tentative. "Are you okay?" The woman looked up, startled, as if she hadn't expected anyone to notice her. Her face softened as she studied Landon for a moment, and then she nodded. "I'm fine," she replied, though her eyes told a different story. Just going through some things." Landon smiled, a warmth in his heart that he couldn't quite explain. "I understand," he said gently. "Sometimes we all go through tough times. But I believe there's something bigger than all of this, a love and peace that can carry us through anything." The woman looked at him, confusion in her eyes. But Landon continued, speaking from a place deep inside him. "I'm not sure what you're going through, but I've been through something recently, something that changed my life. And I can tell you that there's hope, there is light, and it's waiting for you. If you just open your heart, you'll feel it." The woman didn't respond right away, but her eyes softened. There was a flicker of recognition in them. Maybe she didn't fully understand, but there was something about Landon's words that resonated within her. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice tinged with emotion. I think I needed to hear that." Landon smiled again, the warmth in his chest growing as he saw the faintest glimmer of hope in her eyes. As he walked away, he realized that his mission wasn't about doing everything perfectly or having all the answers. It was simply about being there for people when they needed it most, about showing them that there was something beyond the struggles of everyday life. And it wasn't just for strangers. It was for his friends, his family, and even himself. The mission was for all of them, and it was unfolding one step at a time. As the days passed, Landon found himself speaking to more people, offering them comfort and peace in small, unassuming ways. But with every conversation, with every person he reached, he felt the calling growing stronger. His purpose was clearer now. He was meant to bring hope, love, and faith to those who were lost, just as he had once been. But even as he shared this message with others, Landon knew that there was still so much more to uncover. The road ahead was long, and he had only just begun to understand the true depth of the calling he'd received. There was still so much to learn. But Landon knew one thing for sure. He was on the right path, and the journey had only just begun. If you enjoyed this chapter and want to be a part of this journey, don't forget to like the video and leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and your name. We would love to give you a special shout out in the next video as a way to show our appreciation for your support. Your name could be featured, and we'd love to celebrate you as part of our growing community. We can't wait to connect with you. Keep watching, and remember, your journey, just like Landon's, is only beginning. The days that follow were filled with both peace and unease. Landon could feel a shift in the air around him, as though something was changing on a deeper level. Something he couldn't yet fully comprehend. But the message he'd been carrying, the hope he had been sharing, was beginning to take root in his heart in ways he never imagined. There was a quiet power in simplicity. One morning, while sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee and watching the sunlight stream through the window, Landon felt it again. A sense of something far greater than himself. Something both overwhelming and comforting at once. It wasn't a voice this time, but a feeling. A deep knowing that surged through him like an unspoken truth. He closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair. The words of scripture that had once seemed distant now echoed clearly in his mind. The promises of peace, the assurances of God's presence, and the knowledge that everything he had experienced had a divine purpose. Landon had always known the stories, the prayers, the teachings, but now they were more than just words. They were alive in him, resonating in the deepest parts of his soul. The more he embraced them, the more he understood that the peace he sought wasn't something to be found. It was something to be surrendered to, something that already surrounded him, waiting for him to accept it. His thoughts drifted back to that moment of clarity he had experienced earlier in his journey. The moment when he first heard the call, the first time he felt the presence of God so deeply that it left him breathless. It was a feeling he could never quite explain, but one he could never forget. And now, it was happening again. Landon's body trembled as a profound sense of peace washed over him, and he felt a connection to something larger than himself. It wasn't just a fleeting thought or an emotional high. It was real, tangible, and it left him with a quiet sense of awe. This peace wasn't something he could manufacture. It was a gift, a grace that he could only receive. In that moment, Landon felt an overwhelming certainty that his life and the lives of those around him had a purpose far greater than the struggles, the pain, and the confusion he had faced. Everything, the losses, the pain, the fear, had led him to this very moment, where he could finally understand what it all meant. His mind traveled to a specific Bible verse. The peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Philippians 4 verse 7. Landon had always heard these words, but now they were real. The peace of God wasn't something to strive for. It was a gift, a presence that could guard him through the storms of life. It wasn't an absence of conflict, but rather the ability to face that conflict with an unshakable assurance that God was with him. As he sat there, reflecting on everything he had come to understand, Landon knew that he had been given a glimpse of something extraordinary. This wasn't just a personal revelation. It was a call to action, a commission to live out the peace and love he had experienced. It wasn't enough to simply feel it himself. He was called to share it with others. The revelation was clear now. It wasn't about finding answers to every question or understanding every mystery. It was about living with faith, embracing God's presence, and being a conduit for his peace and love in a broken world. And the peace Landon had discovered wasn't a passive thing. It was active, transformative. It called him to stand firm in his faith and to show others the way, even when he didn't have all the answers. The mission wasn't about perfect knowledge. It was about perfect trust. Trust in the unseen, in the divine plan that was unfolding around him, even when the path ahead was uncertain. Landon stood up from the table, feeling a renewed sense of strength. There was much more to learn and much more to do. The road ahead would not be easy, but he knew that with each step, he would be guided. It wasn't a promise of an easy life, but a promise of peace in the midst of the storm. In the quiet of that moment, Landon knew that he had been changed forever. This wasn't just about him. It was about the world, about sharing this peace with anyone who would listen. And so, the journey continued. As Landon set out on his journey, there was a fire in his heart that refused to be extinguished. The days felt long, but each one brought him closer to something that could no longer be ignored. His purpose, one so vague and distant, now burned with clarity. There was a mission to fulfill, a call that could no longer be denied. He had learned the language of peace, but it wasn't enough to keep it to himself. The world around him was fractured, broken, desperate for the kind of peace he had found. How could he possibly keep this gift to himself? Every encounter, every conversation became a moment to share what he had discovered. And with each word, he realized that he wasn't just talking about faith. He was offering people the chance to experience something real, something lasting. The same peace that had transformed him could touch others too. The road ahead wasn't always clear. There were days of doubt, days when the weight of the world seemed too much to bear. But even in those moments, there was always a quiet whisper within him, an unshakable certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Landon met people along the way who were also seeking, who were also yearning for answers. They weren't looking for solutions or fixes. They were looking for peace. And Landon, in his simple faith, became the messenger of that peace. It wasn't about performing miracles or offering profound wisdom. It was about living out the truth of his own experience, about being a living testament to the power of faith. Each day, each step he took, was a testament to the grace and peace that had enveloped his life. His mission wasn't to change the world with grand gestures. It was to quietly change lives through simple acts of love and service. One evening, As he sat on the porch of a small farmhouse, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Landon felt the weight of his mission settle deeper into his soul. The call had become unmistakable. This was what he was meant to do. This was the life he had been given, the path he had been called to walk. The quiet peace he had found was never just for him. It was meant to be shared. He had been entrusted with something far greater than any of his previous aspirations. And the more he embraced it, the more he realized that he wasn't alone in this mission. There were others, countless others, who were just waiting for someone to show them the way. In the days that followed, Landon felt more and more connected to people around him. He found joy in the smallest of moments, a smile shared with a stranger, a word of encouragement to a friend, a quiet prayer offered in the stillness of night. He knew that his mission was not just about what he said, but about how he lived. It was about embodying the peace he had received and offering it to the world in the most genuine way possible. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Landon felt no fear. He knew that as long as he stayed faithful to the call, the path would be revealed step by step. It wasn't about perfection. It was about trust. Trust in the journey, trust in the purpose, and most importantly, trust in the one who had called him to this mission. As he laid down to sleep that night, Landon closed his eyes with a heart full of gratitude. He had been given a mission, a purpose, and a peace that transcended everything he had ever known. The journey was far from over, but he no longer feared the unknown. He walked forward, not with his own strength, but with the peace that came from a deeper source, a peace that was enough to carry him through every challenge, every storm. Landon understood now. His mission was not just about him. It was about the world. It was about bringing peace, hope, and love to a world that so desperately needed it. And he would continue walking one step at a time until that mission was fulfilled. If you've been touched by this story and want to be part of our growing community, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. It's free, and your support means the world to us. We do this because we're passionate about sharing messages of peace, hope, and faith, and your likes and subscriptions help keep us going. We don't make any money doing this. We're doing it because we believe in it. So, if you feel connected to what we're sharing, your support by liking and subscribing would be a huge help to us in continuing this mission. Thank you for being part of our community. The days that followed were full of quiet reflection. Landon had completed his mission, or at least the first part of it, and as he looked back on everything he had experienced, he could see that it wasn't just a destination that mattered, it was a journey itself. The countless lives he had touched, the moments of connection, and the quiet understanding that flowed between him and those he encountered. These were the true treasures. But as much as he had accomplished, Landon knew deep down that this wasn't the end. His mission was still unfolding, and there was a part of him that could feel it, the pull towards something greater, something even more profound. He had witnessed the power of peace and faith in the lives of others, but there was more to come. Landon sat quietly by the window one evening, watching the stars slowly emerge as the night sky darkened. It was in moments like these that he felt closest to the divine. His journey was no longer just about spreading a message. It was about becoming a messenger of hope, of love, of faith. He had learned to trust in the path that had been laid before him, and he knew that the next step would be revealed in time. But even though he felt ready for what lay ahead, there was still a sense of urgency within him. The world was still in need of what he had found: peace, love, and faith. And it was his responsibility to share that message as far and wide as possible. As he prepared to leave the quiet peace of his home and venture into the world once again, Landon felt a deep sense of gratitude. He was ready, more than ever, to continue his mission. He had learned that life was not about waiting for the perfect moment, but about stepping into the call wherever it led. It was about trusting that the journey would take him exactly where he needed to be, no matter how uncertain the road seemed. The next chapter of his mission was already unfolding before him, and all he had to do was walk forward with faith. He knew that his purpose would become even clearer as he continued to live out the message of peace that had transformed his life. And then, in that quiet moment, a thought struck him. This is not the end of the story, but the beginning. If you feel that something deep within you is resonating with this message, I invite you to continue this journey with us. There's a new video waiting for you that could be just what you need to hear. It's going to be revealing, transformative, and filled with messages that might change your life. All you have to do is click the video that's appearing on your screen now. And before you go, don't forget to give us a like and comment amen below. Your support and your comments help us know that we're making a difference. And when you comment amen, you're also inviting more blessings into your life. Thank you for being a part of our community. We're so glad you're here with us. May you continue to be blessed on your journey.